He watched her every move with disgust, convinced she was stealing from him. But what Sterling Maddox discovered when he followed his maid would shatter everything he believed about the woman who cleaned his floors. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the ranch house as Sterling Maddox stood behind the heavy curtains of his study, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the figure hunched over his kitchen floor. Cora Whitmore moved with mechanical precision. Hair-worn dress clinging to her thin frame as she scrubbed away at stains that had been there since morning. Brown hair, always pulled back in the same tired knot, had wisps escaping around her face, damp with sweat. Sterling's jaw tightened as he watched her work. For 3 months now, he'd noticed things going missing from his house. Small things at first. A silver spoon, some coins left on his desk, a bottle of expensive whiskey that seemed to empty faster than it should. His mind immediately went to the most obvious suspect. The poor woman who had access to every room in his house. The way she avoided his eyes when he spoke to her only confirmed his suspicions. The way she quickly pocketed her wages without a word of thanks. The way she seemed to hurry through her work as if eager to leave with whatever she'd managed to steal that day. He stepped away from the window, his expensive boots clicking against the polished wood floor. Sterling Maddox was not a man who tolerated theft, especially not from someone he'd shown the kindness of employing despite her obvious desperation. He'd built his fortune through careful attention to detail and trusting no one. And he wasn't about to let some desperate woman make a fool of him. As he watched Cora gather her cleaning supplies, Sterling made a decision that would change everything. Today, he would follow her. Today he would discover exactly where his missing belongings were going and what this woman was really doing with the money he paid her. Cass stood slowly, her hand pressing against her lower back as if it pained her. She collected her worn shawl from the hook by the kitchen door and wrapped it around her shoulders despite the heat. Sterling noticed how she glanced nervously toward his study as if sensing his presence before stepping out into the blazing afternoon. Sterling waited exactly 30 seconds before moving to the front window. He watched as Cora walked down the dusty path that led away from his ranch. Her pace steady but unhurried. She carried herself with a strange dignity despite her circumstances, something that had always irritated him. Poor people, in his experience, should look grateful for any work they could get. He grabbed his hat from the rack and slipped out the back door, keeping low as he made his way to where his horse waited in the stable. The animal, a powerful chestnut stallion, barely made a sound as Sterling mounted and began following the small figure walking along the dirt road. The sun beat down relentlessly as Sterling kept his distance, using the scattered trees and rock formations to stay hidden. Cora walked with purpose, taking a route he'd never seen her use before. Instead of heading toward the main part of town where the other servants and laborers lived, she turned off onto a smaller path that led toward the old abandoned section on the outskirts. Sterling's suspicions grew stronger with each step. What business could she possibly have in that area? The only things out there were empty buildings and the kind of people who preferred to stay hidden from decent folk. His missing belongings were probably being sold to some fence. Or worse, she was meeting with accomplices to plan bigger thefts from his property. As they crested a small hill, Sterling could see Cora's destination in the distance. It was an old wooden structure, paint peeling and roof sagging that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. Smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting someone was living there. Though Sterling couldn't imagine who would choose such a place, he dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy tree, then crept closer on foot. The building was larger than it had appeared from a distance, and as he drew near, he could hear something that made him pause. Voices. Children's voices. And they were calling out a name that made his blood run cold. Miss Cora. Miss Cora's back. Sterling pressed himself against the side of the building, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Through a gap in the weathered boards, he could see inside, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through that crack in the weathered wood, Sterling saw a sight that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. 6 children, ranging from what looked like 5 to 12 years old, surrounded Cora as she entered the ramshackle building. Their clothes were patched and faded, but clean. Their faces were thin, but bright with genuine joy at seeing her. But it was what Ka did next that stopped Sterling's breath entirely. She reached into her worn cloth bag and pulled out items he recognized immediately. Bread from his kitchen, apples from his orchards, and a small jar of preserves from his pantry. Not stolen goods to be sold, but food to feed hungry children. Sterling watched in stunned silence as Ka knelt down to the children's level. Her tired face transforming into something beautiful as she smiled at them. A little girl with blonde braids threw her arms around Cora's neck. And Sterling could see tears in his maid's eyes as she held the child close. "Did you bring medicine for Tommy?" asked a boy who couldn't have been more than 8, his voice filled with worry. Cora nodded and pulled out a small bottle that Sterling now realized was the expensive tonic he'd thought she'd stolen from his medicine cabinet. She moved toward a makeshift bed in the corner where a smaller boy lay, his face flushed with fever. Sterling watched as she carefully measured out the medicine, her hand steady and sure. The boy who'd asked about Tommy looked up at Cora with eyes that held too much responsibility for his age. "The rentman came by again today, Miss Cora. He says, if we don't have the money by week's end." Cora's shoulders sagged slightly, but she forced another smile. "Don't you worry about that now, Marcus. We'll figure something out." Sterling felt something crack inside his chest as he watched this woman he despised and suspected, reach into her small purse and count out what looked like every penny she had. The money he'd paid her just hours ago, money she desperately needed, was being divided among the children for their basic needs. Through the gap, he could see the interior of the building more clearly now. It was barely holding together with gaps in the walls stuffed with old rags to keep out the wind. The floor was clean but worn smooth by years of use. In one corner, someone had tried to create a small school area with a few books and a slate board. In another, a cooking area with the most basic of supplies. But despite the poverty, despite the obvious struggles, there was something in this place that Sterling had never seen in his own grand house. Love. Real unconditional love flowing between these forgotten children and the woman who was sacrificing everything to care for them. Cora began unpacking more items from her bag. Soap, clean rags, what looked like portions of the dinner she should have taken home for herself. Sterling realized with growing horror that every theft he suspected her of was actually an act of mercy toward children who had nothing. "Miss Cora." The little blonde girl tugged at her dress. "Are you going to stay for supper tonight?" Cora smoothed the child's hair with infinite tenderness. "I'm afraid I can't tonight, sweet pea. You have to get home before dark, but I'll be back tomorrow." "Promise?" The child's voice held the kind of desperation that spoke of too many broken promises from adults. "You promise?" Cora whispered, and Sterling could hear the absolute conviction in her voice. This woman would keep her word to these children, even if it killed her. As Sterling watched, Cora began helping the children prepare their meager meal. Turning the small amount of food she'd brought into something that would somehow feed them all. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make miracles out of nothing. The sick boy, Tommy, called out weakly from his bed, and Cora immediately went to him, pressing her hand to his forehead and whispering words of comfort. Sterling could see the worry in her face, the way she bit her lip as she felt the child's fever. "Marcus," she called softly to the older boy. "Has he been drinking the willow bark tea I showed you how to make?" "Yes, Miss Cora, but it doesn't seem to be helping much." Sterling watched as his maid. No, this angel who'd been working in his house, knelt beside the sick child and began singing a soft lullaby. Her voice was beautiful, filled with the kind of love that could heal hearts, if not bodies. But it was what happened next that would change Sterling Maddox forever. As Ka sang, she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out something that made Sterling's blood freeze in his veins. It was the silver locket he'd thought she'd stolen, the one that had belonged to his late mother. But instead of selling it as he'd assumed, Cora was showing it to the children. And what she said next shattered every assumption he'd ever made about her. "This belonged to a lady who was very kind to me once," Cora said softly, holding the silver locket so the children could see it gleam in the dim light. "She told me that sometimes when we're scared or lonely, we can hold something beautiful and remember that there's still good in the world." Sterling's hands trembled as he pressed against the wall. That locket had been his mother's most treasured possession, and he'd been searching for it frantically for weeks. But Ka wasn't planning to sell it. She was using it to bring comfort to frightened children. Little Tommy reached out a weak hand to touch the locket, and Cora gently placed it in his palm. "Do hold on to this tonight, sweetheart. Let it remind you that you're loved." Sterling felt his throat close up as he watched this scene unfold. The locket that represented his family's legacy, his mother's memory, was being used exactly as his mother would have wanted, to bring hope to someone who needed it most. Marcus, the older boy, moved closer to Cora with obvious reluctance. Miss Cora, I need to tell you something about the money. Cora's face immediately filled with concern. What about it? He heard the rentman talking to someone outside. He said, if we can't pay, he's not just going to throw us out. Is it? There are people who pay good money for children who don't have families to look for them. The color drained from Cora's face, and Sterling felt ice form in his veins. He knew exactly what the boy was talking about. The kind of people who preyed on vulnerable children, selling them into situations no child should ever face. How much time do we have? Cora's voice was steady, but Sterling could see her hands shaking. 3 days, Marcus whispered. Miss Cora, what are we going to do? Sterling watched as Ka pulled all the children into a tight circle around her. Despite the terror that must have been coursing through her, she managed to keep her voice calm and reassuring. We're going to figure this out, she said firmly. He won't let anything happen to any of you. He promise. But Sterling could see the desperation in her eyes. The way she was calculating and recalculating in her head, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. The amount these children owed was more than Ka made in 3 months working for him. As he watched, Ka began settling the children for the night, tucking thin blankets around each one and making sure they felt safe despite the threat hanging over them. She sang softly as she moved between them, her voice carrying a strength that belied her small frame. When the last child had drifted off to sleep, Sterling saw Cora sink into the single chair in the room, her head falling into her hands. For the first time since he'd been watching, she allowed herself to show the full weight of her burden. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that she muffled against her palms, careful not to wake the children. Sterling felt something break open inside his chest as he watched this woman. This woman he judged so harshly, cry alone in the darkness. She was carrying the weight of 6 lives on her shoulders, sacrificing everything she had. And still, it wasn't enough. But what Sterling saw next would haunt him forever. Cora reached into her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Even from his hidden position, Sterling could see it was a letter worn from being read many times. As she unfolded it, a small jury-type fell out, and Sterling's world tilted on its axis. The photograph was of a man in military uniform, and the resemblance to little Tommy was unmistakable, but it was what Ka whispered as she looked at the image that stopped Sterling's heart cold. I'm sorry, James, Cora whispered to the photograph, her voice breaking. I'm sorry I couldn't save him in time. I'm sorry I couldn't save any of them. Sterling felt the ground shift beneath him as the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The man in the uniform, the resemblance to Tommy. The way Ka spoke about these children as if she'd failed them somehow. She wasn't just a stranger helping orphans. These children were connected to her in ways he was only beginning to understand. Cora pressed the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes. He promised I'd take care of them all. I promised I'd keep them together, but I'm failing just like I failed with their fathers. Sterling watched as she carefully refolded the letter and tucked it back into her dress. Then she stood and moved quietly to check on each sleeping child, adjusting blankets and smoothing hair with the tenderness of a mother. When she reached Tommy's bed, she knelt beside him and gently took back the silver locket, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. The boy stirred slightly in his sleep, and Ka began humming the same lullaby she'd sung earlier. It was then that Sterling noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the flickering candlelight, he could see that Cora's hands were shaking violently, and her face had taken on a grayish pallor. She was ill, seriously ill, and had been hiding it while caring for these children. As if sensing his observation, Cora suddenly swayed on her feet and had to grip the edge of Tommy's bed to keep from falling. She pressed her hand to her chest, her breathing becoming labored, but she forced herself to remain quiet so as not to wake the children. Sterling realized with growing horror that this woman was literally sacrificing her life for these children. She was sick, possibly dying, and instead of seeking help for herself, she was spending every penny she earned and every ounce of strength she had to keep them safe. But what happened next would change everything Sterling thought he knew about sacrifice and love. Cora reached into her bag and pulled out one more item, something Sterling hadn't seen her take from his house. It was his father's gold pocket watch, the one he'd inherited and treasured above all his possessions. The one he'd been frantically searching for, and had been certain she'd stolen. But instead of keeping it or selling it, Cora was looking at it with the expression of someone about to make the ultimate sacrifice. Sterling watched in stunned silence as she traced the engraving on the watch's surface. His family's initials intertwined in elegant script. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the watch as if it could hear her. "I'm sorry it has to be this way, but they need this more than anyone needs to know the truth." Sterling's mind raced as he tried to understand what she meant. What truths? What connection could this woman possibly have to his family's watch that would make her speak to it as if it held secrets? Cora stood slowly, still clutching the watch, and moved toward a loose floorboard in the corner of the room. Sterling watched as she pried it up and placed the watch inside what appeared to be a small hiding place. But she wasn't hiding it to keep it. She was hiding it to protect it until she could sell it to save the children. As she replaced the floorboard, Cora swayed again, this time more violently. She pressed both hands to her chest, and Sterling could see her struggling to breathe. Whatever illness was consuming her was getting worse, and the stress of the children's situation was accelerating her decline. But it was what she did next that revealed the final devastating truth about who Cora Whitmore really was and why she had Sterling Maddox's most precious family heirloom. Cora reached into her dress once more and pulled out another letter. This one sealed and yellowed with age. Sterling could see his own name written across the front in handwriting he didn't recognize. As she held it, her lips moved in what looked like a prayer. And then she spoke words that shattered Sterling's understanding of everything. "He should have given this to him when I first came to work at the ranch," she whispered to the sleeping children. "But I was too proud, too ashamed, and now it might be too late for all of us." Sterling pressed closer to the gap in the wall, his heart hammering as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A letter addressed to him in the possession of his maid, hidden away like a secret that could change everything. Cora moved to the single candle burning in the room, and held the letter near the flame, as if considering destroying it. But then she looked at the children and her resolve seemed to weaken. She couldn't destroy their only hope, no matter how much shame it might bring her. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said softly to little Tommy, who stirred but didn't wake. "He tried to do right by everyone, even when it cost him everything. Maybe his son has some of that same goodness in him." Sterling felt his knees buckle as the implications of her words hit him. His grandfather had died when Sterling was young, but he'd been known throughout the territory for his fairness and compassion. What connection could Cora possibly have to his family that went back that far? As if in answer to his thoughts, Cora began speaking again, her voice growing weaker with each word. "I should have told Mr. Maddox the truth from the beginning," she said, sinking back into the chair. "Should have told him that these children that she couldn't finish the sentence, but Sterling could see the weight of whatever secret she carried crushing her spirit." Suddenly, Cora's breathing became even more labored, and she doubled over in pain. Sterling watched in alarm as she gripped the arms of the chair, her face contorting in agony. The illness that had been slowly consuming her was reaching a critical point, and she was alone with 6 children depending on her. But even in her pain, Cora's first thought was for the children. She forced herself to stand and checked each one, making sure they were still sleeping peacefully. Then she moved to a small shelf and pulled down a bottle of what looked like medicine. But Sterling could see that it was nearly empty. As she measured out a small dose for herself, Sterling realized she'd been rationing her own medicine, probably giving most of it to Tommy and the other children when they were sick. She was literally dying so that they could live. The medicine seemed to help slightly, and Cora's breathing eased enough for her to move around the room again. But Sterling could see that it was temporary relief at best. Without proper medical care, this woman wouldn't serve.